I paid $2,400 to fix my sister's transmission in September. And 3 weeks later, she threw my birthday gift in the trash while her husband laughed at me. That's when I decided they needed to learn what gratitude actually means. And Christmas dinner at my parents' house seemed like the perfect classroom. Let me back up because this situation has layers that'll make you understand why I spent 2 months planning what happened at that dinner table. My sister Sophie is 30, and I'm 32. We grew up pretty normal, middle-class family in the suburbs. Nothing fancy, but our parents, Hugo and Noel, always made sure we had what we needed. Sophie married Paul 3 years ago, and that's when everything started changing with her. Paul comes from money, or at least his family acts like they do. And suddenly my sister, who used to shop at Target, was posting photos with designer shopping bags and talking about how they only eat at restaurants I'd never heard of. The thing is, I work in commercial property management, and I'm good at what I do. I make decent money, I own my condo, I've got savings. I'm not rich, but I'm stable, and I worked hard to get here. Sophie and Paul, on the other hand, live in this rental house that costs more than my mortgage and drive cars they can barely afford. Paul works in sales, something with medical equipment, and Sophie does social media marketing for a local boutique. Neither of them makes the kind of money their lifestyle suggests, but they're obsessed with looking successful. I noticed it at family dinners over the past 2 years. Sophie would make these little comments about my car being practical, about how I should really update my wardrobe, about how it's important to invest in quality things. Paul would jump in with advice about networking and image and how people judge you on appearances. They weren't mean exactly, just condescending in that way that makes you feel like you're being patted on the head by people who think they're better than you. My parents would shut it down sometimes. Dad would tell Sophie to stop being materialistic. Mom would change the subject, but it kept happening. Every family gathering became this weird performance where Sophie and Paul showed off their new purchases and made subtle digs at everyone else's choices. My parents have been married 35 years. They're comfortable and happy, but Sophie started making comments about how they should renovate their kitchen or update their furniture. Like their perfectly fine house wasn't good enough anymore. Then in early September, Sophie called me on a Thursday afternoon. She was crying, actually genuinely upset, and told me their car broke down. The transmission was gone, and they needed $2,400 to fix it. They didn't have it. She said they were between paychecks and everything was tied up, and they were desperate. She asked if I could loan them the money. She promised they'd pay me back by the end of October at the latest. She was so sorry to ask, but they had no other option, and Paul needed the car for work. I said yes immediately because she's my sister, and she sounded genuinely scared. I transferred the money that day. Sophie cried with relief and thanked me about 15 times and said I was saving them, that she'd never forget this, that she owed me everything. Paul got on the phone and thanked me too. Told me he really appreciated it and they'd get me paid back as soon as possible. October came and went. No payment, no mention of it. I didn't bring it up because I figured they were struggling and I didn't want to make it worse. My birthday is November 8th and my parents always do a family dinner for it. Sophie and Paul showed up with expensive wine and Paul was wearing a new watch I definitely noticed. They hugged me, wished me happy birthday. The whole thing seemed normal. I brought them a gift the following weekend when I stopped by their place. I'd spent actual time on this, not just money. I made them a custom photo album, nice quality leather cover, filled with pictures from their wedding and trips they'd taken and family moments. I added captions and little notes, organized it chronologically. The whole thing probably took me 8 hours to put together, plus the cost of printing and the album itself. I thought it was thoughtful, something they'd actually appreciate since they're always posting photos of everything. Sophie opened it at their kitchen table. Paul was standing behind her looking over her shoulder. She flipped through maybe 3 pages and I watched her expression just go flat. She closed it and pushed it across the table and said, "Thanks, that's nice." That was it. Paul picked it up and flipped through it, faster, barely looking. And then he actually laughed. He said, "Look at this cheap garbage he brought us. He thinks we'd actually want this." Sophie laughed too and said, "I probably spent like $20 on it. What was she supposed to do with a scrapbook like some grandma?" I just sat there. Paul walked over to their trash can, the one in their kitchen, and dropped the album in. He said maybe I should focus on updating my own life before making crafts for other people. Sophie told me not to be offended. They just have different tastes now. They're not really into that kind of sentimental stuff anymore. She said it like she was explaining something simple to a child. I didn't argue. I didn't get mad outwardly. I said, "Okay, no problem, I understand." I left their house and sat in my car for 10 minutes just processing what happened. They threw away something I made for them. They called it garbage. They laughed at me. After I gave them $2,400 3 months ago that they never paid back and never even mentioned again. That's when I decided they needed a reality check, and I needed to be the one to deliver it. Because here's what they didn't know that I knew. Paul's parents don't actually have money. They're mortgaged to their eyeballs and they refinanced their house twice. I know this because Paul's dad, Spencer, banks at the same credit union I use, and I've seen him there multiple times looking stressed and having intense conversations with loan officers. Small town people talk, and the property management world is smaller than you think. Sophie and Paul's lifestyle is funded by credit cards and family loans they're not paying back and keeping up appearances they can't afford. They're broke. Actually broke. That transmission bill proved it. And they treated me like garbage while depending on my money to survive. I started planning. I knew Christmas dinner at my parents' house was coming up in December. The whole family would be there, including my Aunt Ashley and Uncle Spencer, Paul's parents Hugo and Noel, everyone in one room. I spent November gathering information, screenshots, receipts, messages. I kept every text Sophie sent me about the car repair. I had the bank transfer showing the $2,400. I started paying attention to their social media posts, screenshotting the expensive restaurants and shopping bags and vacation photos they kept posting throughout October and November while owing me thousands. I also made copies of some other things I'd noticed. Sophie had asked to borrow money from our parents twice in the past year. Small amounts, a few hundred here and there. Mom mentioned it once casually. I asked Mom about it carefully, just curious conversation, and found out Sophie had borrowed $800 total and hadn't paid any of it back. Sophie told them the same thing. Between paychecks, temporary situation, would pay it back soon. Paul's parents had loaned them money too. I didn't know the exact amount, but I heard them talking about it at Sophie's wedding reception 3 years ago. Something about helping with the wedding costs. I filed all of this away. December 24th, Christmas Eve, dinner at my parents' house. Everyone arrived around 5. Sophie and Paul showed up with expensive champagne and a huge gift basket of gourmet foods for my parents. They'd clearly spent $200 on it minimum. Sophie was wearing a new dress. Paul had another new watch. They were laughing and hugging everyone and playing the perfect successful couple. Dinner was the usual. Ham, sides, too much food. Everyone sitting around my parents' dining room table talking and joking. Sophie and Paul dominated the conversation talking about their plans for a vacation they were planning to Mexico in February. They'd apparently already booked it. Paul was describing the resort and the excursions, and Sophie was showing everyone photos on her phone. My dad asked how they could afford Mexico right now. Not mean, just genuinely curious since he knew they'd had the car trouble. Paul laughed and said they'd been saving up. They budgeted carefully. They prioritized experiences over material things. The irony was so thick I almost choked. Dessert came out. Pie and cookies. Everyone was relaxed and full and in that comfortable post-dinner mood. That's when I stood up and said I wanted to say something before we ate dessert, that I wanted to share something about gratitude since it was Christmas and family was important. Sophie looked at me. Paul looked at me. My parents looked confused but supportive, like they thought I was going to make some nice speech. I pulled out my phone. I said I wanted to talk about what gratitude really means and what family means and how we treat each other when someone helps us in our time of need. I opened my Photos app. I had everything organized in an album. Screenshots, receipts, text messages, social media posts. I said let's start with September when Sophie called me crying because they couldn't afford to fix their car. I showed the text messages. I showed the bank transfer of $2,400. I read out loud some of Sophie's messages about how desperate they were and how grateful they were and how they'd never forget my help. The table went quiet. Sophie's face changed. Paul put his fork down. I said that was September 18th. Then I started scrolling through screenshots of their social media from the following weeks. Expensive dinners, shopping trips, a weekend in Chicago, new purchases. I read the captions out loud where Sophie talked about treating yourself and living your best life, all while owing me $2,400 they promised to pay back by the end of October. My mom said my name like a question. Dad was staring at Sophie. I kept going because I wasn't done, not even close. I said that was just the money part, but there was more. I told everyone about the birthday gift I made them. The photo album I spent hours putting together. I described walking into their kitchen and watching Paul throw it in the trash while calling it cheap garbage. I described Sophie laughing and saying she wasn't into sentimental stuff while they owed me thousands of dollars. Sophie started to say something. I talked over her. I said I thought everyone should know what kind of people they really are. The kind who take money from family and never pay it back, who throw gifts in the trash, who spend money they don't have on appearances while calling other people pathetic losers. Paul stood up. He said I was making a scene, and this wasn't appropriate, and I was ruining Christmas. I said I wasn't ruining anything. I was just sharing the truth, and if the truth ruins Christmas, maybe they should think about why that is. My Aunt Ashley, Paul's mom, asked if this was true. She was looking at Paul. Noelle, my other aunt, was looking at Sophie with this expression I'd never seen before. My dad told everyone to calm down. Sophie was saying I was exaggerating, that it wasn't like that I was taking things out of context. I asked what context makes throwing someone's gift in the trash. Okay. I asked what context makes borrowing thousands and never paying it back while posting photos of expensive vacations acceptable. The table erupted into multiple conversations at once. Paul's dad, Spencer, was demanding to know if they still owed me money. My mom was asking Sophie why she didn't tell them any of this. Sophie was crying now, real tears, saying I was humiliating her on purpose. I said that wasn't even all of it. I looked at my parents and said Sophie borrowed $800 from them earlier this year and never paid it back either. Then I looked at Paul's parents and asked if they knew about the Mexico vacation that was supposedly already booked while Sophie and Paul still owed money to multiple family members. That's when it got really loud. Everyone talking at once. Paul yelling at me, Sophie crying, parents demanding answers. I just stood there with my phone and watched it all unfold exactly like I'd planned. Paul grabbed Sophie and said they were leaving. He said I was vindictive and pathetic, and this was all because I was jealous of their lifestyle. Sophie followed him toward the door, but my dad stood up and told them to sit back down, that they weren't leaving until this got sorted out. Mom was torn between comforting Sophie and demanding explanations. But here's where it gets interesting. Because what I revealed at Christmas dinner was just the opening move. What I had planned for after the holidays, what I'd been setting up for weeks, was the real consequence they needed to face. The dinner was about exposing them to family. The next part was about making sure they actually felt it in ways they couldn't ignore or explain away. And based on the texts I started getting on Christmas Day from both of them, from Sophie's friends, from people I hadn't heard from in years, everyone suddenly had opinions about what happened and what should happen next. This story was just getting started. Update 1. Holy hell, you guys. The response to my original post has been insane. Over 3,000 comments and my inbox is destroyed. Some of you are calling me a hero, some are saying I went too far, and a few think this is fake, which, trust me, I wish it was. To the person who said I should have confronted them privately first, I did that for 3 months by not bringing up the money. They had their chance to be decent humans. Anyway, buckle up because Christmas night got so much worse after my dramatic reveal, and the days following have been absolute chaos. I'm talking multiple family emergency meetings, Sophie having a complete meltdown at a department store, and me discovering just how deep their financial hole actually goes. So after I dropped that bomb at dinner and showed everyone the receipts, my dad told Sophie and Paul to sit back down. Paul refused at first. He kept saying this was inappropriate and I was being manipulative, and they weren't going to be ambushed like this. My dad, who's normally pretty chill, stood up and told Paul in this completely flat tone that if he walked out that door right now, he wasn't welcome back in this house until he explained himself. That got Paul to stop. Sophie was crying, like full-on sobbing into her hands. My mom went over to her, but Dad told Mom to sit down and let Sophie answer for herself. Mom looked torn, but she sat. That's when I realized Dad was actually angry, like genuinely furious in that quiet way he gets that's somehow scarier than yelling. Paul sat back down. Sophie was wiping her face with her napkin. Paul's parents, Hugo and Noelle, were staring at them waiting for answers. My Aunt Ashley looked disgusted. The whole table was tense and silent except for Sophie's crying. Dad asked Sophie directly if she borrowed $2,400 from me in September. Sophie nodded. Dad asked if she paid it back. Sophie shook her head no. Dad asked why not. Sophie started saying something about how things have been tight and they were going to pay me back soon. They just needed a little more time. And I was being cruel bringing this up at Christmas in front of everyone. I said she had 3 months and never once mentioned paying me back. Paul jumped in and said they'd been planning to pay me after the holidays, that I was being impatient, that family doesn't put timelines on helping each other. I asked why they booked a vacation to Mexico if they owed multiple people money. Paul said the vacation was already paid for before the car trouble. It was non-refundable. They couldn't cancel it anyway, so what did it matter? My mom asked when they booked Mexico. Sophie hesitated. Paul said August. I pulled up their Instagram and found the post from November, where Sophie announced they were planning a February vacation and showed everyone photos of the resort. The caption said, "Finally booked our dream vacation." Posted November 15th. I showed the table. Paul's face changed. He said Sophie must have gotten the date wrong, that they booked it earlier and she just posted about it later. Sophie said, "Yeah, that's what happened." She'd been meaning to post about it for months. I asked why the caption said "finally booked" if they'd already booked it in August. Neither of them had an answer for that. Hugo, Paul's dad, asked about the money they borrowed for the wedding 3 years ago. Paul said they'd been paying that back in installments, Hugo said they'd made exactly two payments totaling $1,200 and then stopped. They still owed $6,800 from the original $8,000 loan. The table went quiet again. Noelle said she'd been asking Paul about it for months and he kept saying it was coming, that business was good and they'd pay them back soon. Paul started getting defensive. He said business was good, that he had major deals closing in January, that everyone was acting like they were criminals when they'd just had some cash flow problems. Sophie said they weren't the only people who ever struggled with money, that I was making them sound like terrible people when all they did was hit a rough patch. I said rough patches don't involve throwing gifts in the trash and calling people pathetic losers. Sophie claimed I was exaggerating what happened, that Paul was joking around and I took it too seriously, that I was being sensitive. I asked her to explain what context makes dropping a handmade gift in the garbage funny. She said I was twisting everything, that they'd been having a bad day and they're sorry if I felt hurt, but this public humiliation wasn't proportional. Mom asked about the $800 Sophie borrowed from them. Sophie said she paid most of it back. Dad said she'd paid back $200 total over 6 months ago. Sophie said she thought she'd paid more than that. Dad said he keeps records of everything. She'd paid back exactly $200, and that was in June, and it was now December. The arguments went in circles for another 20 minutes. Paul kept insisting they were going to pay everyone back, that they had a plan, that I'd sabotage them by doing this publicly instead of talking to them privately. I said I gave them 3 months of private time to handle it, and they spent that time buying expensive wine and booking vacations. Sophie said the wine was a gift and they were trying to maintain family relationships, that bringing nice things to dinner was about respect. Ashley said maintaining family relationships usually involves paying back money you borrowed. Paul told her to stay out of it. This was between us. Ashley said her son owed her money, and that made it very much her business. Paul said they were working on it and everyone needed to be patient. Eventually, Sophie and Paul left around 9. They didn't storm out. They just quietly gathered their coats and said Merry Christmas and walked out the door. The rest of us sat there in this heavy silence. Then Mom started crying, which I wasn't expecting. She said she couldn't believe Sophie would take money from family and just forget about it, that she didn't raise her to be like that. Dad was processing everything. You could see him working through what it meant that his daughter had been lying to multiple people. Hugo and Noelle left shortly after. Hugo looked exhausted. He pulled me aside before leaving and thanked me for bringing this up because they'd been wondering for 2 years why Paul kept stalling on payments. He said they'd been covering some of Paul's expenses thinking he was genuinely struggling, but now he was questioning everything. Christmas Day was weird. Sophie sent me a long text at 7 a.m. saying I'd humiliated her in front of the entire family, that what I did was vindictive and cruel, that she would have paid me back eventually, and I'd destroyed her relationship with our parents over money. She said Paul's parents were furious with them and it was all my fault, that I could have handled this privately, but I chose to make a scene because I was jealous of their lifestyle and success. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to see what else she'd say. She sent 3 more texts over the next hour. Each one got more desperate. She said she was sorry about the photo album, that Paul had been stressed about work and took it out on my gift, that she should have defended me but she didn't realize how much it hurt me. She said they'd pay me back $500 by the end of January, and the rest by summer, if I would just tell Mom and Dad that we'd worked it out. I texted back and said if they had $500 to pay me by January, then they should pay Hugo and Noelle first since they'd been waiting 3 years. Sophie didn't respond to that for hours. When she finally did, she said I was being impossible, that Hugo and Noelle understood their situation, but I was acting like a loan shark over a one-time favor. Paul texted me separately that afternoon. His message was different. He said I'd made an enemy, that what I did at Christmas was warfare, that I'd embarrassed him in front of his parents and destroyed his wife's relationship with her family. He said they would pay back every cent, but it would be on their timeline, not mine. And if I kept pushing this publicly, he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of vindictive person I really was. I screenshot that text and sent it to my dad. Dad called me 10 minutes later and said he and Mom wanted to meet with Sophie and Paul after Christmas, that this needed to be sorted out as a family. I said that was fine, but I wanted my money back before any sorting out happened. Dad said he understood. December 26th, the day after Christmas, Mom called Sophie and set up a meeting at my parents' house for that evening. Sophie agreed. I drove over around 6. Sophie and Paul arrived 15 minutes late. Sophie's eyes were red like she'd been crying all day. Paul looked angry, jaw tight, arms crossed. We all sat in the living room. Dad started by saying this wasn't about taking sides. It was about understanding what happened and finding a solution. Sophie immediately said she'd already apologized to me and she didn't know what else I wanted from her. I said I wanted my $2,400 back. Paul said they'd pay it back when they could, and I needed to stop harassing them about it. Mom asked how they planned to pay anyone back if they were spending money on vacations and expensive gifts. Sophie said the vacation was booked before any of this happened. I pulled up my phone again with the November Instagram post. Sophie said I was obsessed with their social media, and it was creepy. I said it was public, anyone could see it, and if she didn't want people knowing about her purchases, maybe she shouldn't post them online. Dad asked about their actual financial situation. Paul said that was private. Hugo said if they owed his parents $6,800, then it wasn't private anymore. They had a right to know if Paul could actually pay them back. Paul said his sales job had commission structures that made income variable, that they'd had a slow fall, but January always picked up, that he had major clients ready to sign. I asked what happens if those clients don't sign. Paul said they would. I asked what happens if they don't. Paul told me to shut up. Dad told Paul not to talk like that in his house. Paul apologized, but he was gritting his teeth doing it. The meeting went on for over an hour. Nothing got resolved. Sophie cried multiple times. Paul kept deflecting. My parents were clearly disappointed, but trying to be fair. Sophie kept saying I'd made everything worse by going public instead of being patient. I said I'd been patient for 3 months while watching them post vacation photos and buy expensive presents. Finally, Paul said they'd pay me $1,000 by February 1st, and the rest in installments. I said no, I wanted all of it by January 15th. Paul laughed and said I wasn't in a position to make demands. I said actually, I was because I could keep sharing exactly how they treated me and exactly how much they owed people. Sophie started crying again and said I was blackmailing them. Mom asked me to stop. She said threatening them wasn't helping. I said I wasn't threatening anyone. I was stating facts. If they paid me back, I'd have nothing to share. If they didn't, well, people were already asking questions after Christmas dinner. We left it there. No agreement. No resolution. Sophie and Paul left quickly. Mom told me I needed to decide if getting my money back was worth destroying my relationship with my sister. I said Sophie destroyed the relationship when she laughed while her husband threw my gift in the trash. That was December 26th. But here's where it gets interesting because the fallout from Christmas dinner started spreading beyond just our immediate family. And what I learned in the following days made me realize their financial situation was even worse than I thought. Paul's brother Spencer called me on December 27th. I didn't even know he had my number. He said he'd heard about Christmas dinner from his parents and wanted to talk. We met at a sports bar near my condo that evening. Spencer is younger than Paul, maybe 28, works in accounting. He asked me to walk him through exactly what happened at Christmas. I showed him everything. The text from Sophie about the car repair, the bank transfer, the Instagram posts, the timeline of everything. Spencer listened and got quieter and quieter. Then he told me something I hadn't known. Paul and Sophie's rent is $2,800 a month. Their landlord is apparently getting fed up because they've been late on rent 4 times in the past 8 months. Spencer knows this because the landlord contacted Paul's parents, asking if they'd co-sign a new lease. And Hugo told Spencer about it, asking for advice. Spencer said Paul has been borrowing money from their parents for over a year for various emergencies and hasn't paid any of it back. The wedding loan was just the biggest chunk. There have been other smaller loans totaling another $3,000 that Paul never mentioned to anyone. Spencer found out because he does his parents' taxes and saw all the transfers. I asked why he was telling me this. Spencer said because Paul has been making his parents feel guilty for even asking about the money, acting like they're being unreasonable. And now Spencer realizes Paul's been playing them the whole time. He wanted me to know I wasn't wrong for calling them out, but that's not even the most interesting part. Spencer also told me that Paul's sales job isn't going well. His company restructured their commission system in October and Paul's income dropped significantly. Paul hasn't told Sophie this, or if he has, Sophie hasn't told anyone else. Spencer only knows because Paul asked to borrow more money from their parents and mentioned his job situation, then made Spencer promise not to tell anyone because he didn't want Sophie to worry. So now I had a fuller picture. Sophie and Paul are drowning in debt, behind on rent. Paul's income dropped right after I loaned them money for the car, and they're still keeping up appearances on social media while borrowing from every family member who will listen. And they threw my gift in the trash while actively depending on me and everyone else to keep their lifestyle afloat. I realized the Christmas dinner revelation was just the start. They weren't going to change behavior or pay anyone back because they can't. They're trapped in their own image. And the only way out is to keep borrowing and deflecting and hoping no one compares notes. So I started planning the next phase. Because exposing them at Christmas made them defensive and got family asking questions, but it didn't actually solve anything. They're still living the same way, still posting the same content, still owing everyone money. What I needed was to create actual consequences they couldn't avoid or explain away. Consequences that would force them to face reality instead of just crying and making excuses. And I had some ideas about how to make that happen. Ideas that involved their landlord, their social media presence, and the Mexico vacation they were so excited about. But I needed to be careful because if I pushed too hard too fast, I'd look like the bad guy and they'd get sympathy. The key was letting their own actions create the consequences while I just made sure the right people knew the right information at the right time. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to someone, it's letting everyone else see clearly what they've been doing to themselves all along. More updates coming soon because this is far from over. Update 2. Okay, so the comments on my last update were split between people saying I should let it go and people telling me to burn their lives down. Shout out to the commenter who suggested checking if their landlord knew about the late payments. That became very relevant. And to the person who said I was being too nice and should go nuclear, well, keep reading because January has been absolutely wild. Quick recap for anyone just joining. Sophie and Paul owe me $2,400. Owe Paul's parents almost $10,000 total. Owe my parents $600. Threw my handmade gift in the trash and have been living this fake successful lifestyle while drowning in debt. I exposed them at Christmas dinner, and it went about as well as you'd expect. So New Year's came and went. Sophie posted Instagram stories from their New Year's Eve at some upscale restaurant downtown, champagne glasses, fancy cocktails, the whole production. Meanwhile, she still hadn't paid me a single dollar. The audacity was actually impressive at that point. Paul's parents called me on January 2nd asking if Sophie and Paul had reached out to me about payment. I said no. Hugo sounded exhausted. He said they'd tried talking to Paul multiple times since Christmas, and Paul kept saying January would be better once his commission checks came through. I decided it was time to stop waiting for them to do the right thing and start making their situation impossible to ignore. First move was their social media. Sophie had been posting less since Christmas, but she was still maintaining the image. New Year's Eve posts, photos of their decorated house, product recommendations. She had maybe 3,000 followers. Not huge, but enough that people paid attention. Most of her followers were local, people from high school, family friends, coworkers, that kind of audience. I didn't comment on her posts or anything obvious like that. Instead, I started talking to people. Specifically, I reached out to 3 of Sophie's former coworkers from her previous job, people I'd met at family events who she was still friendly with. I told them what happened with the loan and the gift. I showed them the same screenshots and timeline I'd shown at Christmas dinner. I said I wasn't asking them to do anything. I just wanted them to know the truth since Sophie had been portraying a very different version of her life online. 2 of them responded with shock. They'd been seeing Sophie's posts and assumed she and Paul were doing great. One of them, Ashley, not my aunt, different Ashley, said Sophie had actually asked to borrow $200 from her back in October using the same car repair story. Ashley had said no because they weren't that close and it felt weird. Now it made sense. The third person didn't respond, but I saw her unfollow Sophie 2 days later. The thing about social media is that once doubt enters the picture, people start looking differently at everything. Sophie's follower count started dropping slowly. Not dramatically, but steadily. 5 here, 10 there. People were questioning things in their minds even if they weren't commenting publicly. January 4th, Sophie texted me at 11 p.m. asking if I'd been talking about them to people. I said I'd been answering questions honestly when people asked. She said I was sabotaging them, that I was deliberately trying to destroy their reputation. I said their reputation was based on money they borrowed and never paid back, so maybe they should focus on that instead of worrying about what I was saying. She called me immediately. I answered because I wanted to hear what she'd say. Sophie was angry, not crying this time, actually furious. She said I was spreading lies about them and if I didn't stop, they'd have to take legal action. I asked what lies specifically. She said I was telling people they were broke and behind on rent. I said I never mentioned their rent situation to anyone except family. There was a pause. Then she asked how I knew about their rent. I didn't answer that directly. I said if they're not behind on rent, then what's the problem? She said that's not the point. The point is, I was conducting a campaign to humiliate them instead of handling this privately. I said I gave them 3 months of private and they spent it posting vacation photos and buying expensive wine. She said the wine was $30 and I was exaggerating everything. We argued for 20 minutes. Sophie kept saying I was jealous of their lifestyle and success. She actually said that multiple times, that I couldn't stand seeing them happy and thriving while I was alone with my boring, stable job and my boring, stable life. She said that's what this was really about, that I resented them for being more ambitious and wanting more out of life than just mediocrity. That's when I understood something. Sophie genuinely believed the image she'd been projecting. She'd convinced herself that their lifestyle was success, that the debt and borrowed money and late payments were just temporary obstacles that ambitious people overcome. In her mind, I was the pathetic one for living within my means and not taking risks. The photo album incident wasn't cruelty. It was Sophie rejecting what she saw as my small-minded approach to life. Paul throwing it in the trash was him reinforcing that they'd moved beyond that kind of sentimentality. This realization didn't make me sympathetic. It made me angrier, because it meant they weren't going to change or take responsibility. They were going to keep defending their choices and blaming everyone else, until reality forcibly corrected them. I told Sophie I wanted my money by January 15th, or I'd be taking additional steps. She asked what that meant. I said she'd find out if they didn't pay me. She said they couldn't get $2,400 by January 15th. It was impossible. I said they should have thought about that before booking Mexico. She hung up on me. January 5th, I did something I'd been considering since my conversation with Spencer. I looked up their landlord information through property records, which are public in our county. Their rental house is owned by a guy named Hugo who runs a small property management business. I found his business number online and called him on a Thursday afternoon. I introduced myself as Sophie's brother and said I needed to discuss something regarding their tenancy. Hugo was immediately wary, asked what this was about. I said I understood they'd been having issues with late payments and I wanted to make sure he knew their full financial situation before agreeing to any lease renewals. Hugo said he couldn't discuss tenant information with me. I said I wasn't asking for information, I was providing it. I told him about the multiple family loans they hadn't repaid, about Paul's commission income dropping significantly in October, about the pattern of borrowing money for emergencies and never paying it back. I said I was concerned they were overextended and he deserved to know that before making business decisions. Hugo was quiet for a moment. Then he said they'd submitted a lease renewal application for March, and he'd been deliberating on it. They'd been late 4 times in 8 months and each time had a different excuse. He'd been considering requiring a co-signer for the new lease. I said that seemed reasonable given their payment history. Hugo thanked me for the information and said he'd take it into consideration. I know some of you will say that was crossing a line. But here's the thing. They owed me money they weren't paying back while maintaining an expensive rental they could barely afford. Why should I help them keep up appearances when they were treating me like garbage? If they couldn't afford their lifestyle, they needed to downsize, not keep borrowing and deflecting. January 6th, Sophie and Paul showed up at my condo unannounced. I have a video doorbell, so I saw them standing there before I answered. Paul was doing that thing where he shifts his weight and clenches his jaw. Sophie looked anxious. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. Paul said we needed to talk immediately. I said, okay, talk. He said not out in the hallway. I said they could say whatever they needed to say right there. Paul looked at Sophie and then back at me and said their landlord called them asking questions about their finances and family loans, and the only person who would have told him was me. I said I had a conversation with their landlord as a concerned family member. Paul said I had no right to interfere with their housing situation. I said I had every right to make sure people knew the truth about who they were dealing with. Sophie said I was trying to get them evicted. I said I was trying to get paid back, and if that created housing problems for them, maybe they should have prioritized differently. Paul stepped closer. He said I was making a huge mistake, that they had lawyers in their family, that interfering with someone's housing could be considered harassment. I said talking to a landlord about publicly documented payment issues wasn't harassment. Paul said we'd see about that. Sophie pulled him back and said this wasn't helping. Then Sophie tried a different approach. She said they could pay me $800 by the end of January if I would stop talking to people about their finances. I asked about the other $1,600. She said they'd pay it in $400 monthly installments, starting in February. I said no, I wanted it all by February 1st or the deal was off. Paul said that was impossible, and I knew it. I said then they should cancel Mexico and use that money to pay their debts. Sophie said the vacation was already paid for and non-refundable. I said most resorts and airlines offered cancellation for a fee or credit for future travel. Sophie said they weren't canceling their vacation because I was being vindictive. I said they owed almost $10,000 to various family members and they were going on vacation, and somehow I was the problem in this scenario. Paul said the vacation was an investment in their mental health and their marriage, that they'd been planning it for months, that they deserved to have something to look forward to. I said they could look forward to paying back their debts. Paul told me I was a petty, bitter person who couldn't stand to see other people happy. I said happy people don't throw gifts in the trash. The conversation went in circles for another 10 minutes in my hallway. Neighbors were definitely listening. Eventually, Sophie started crying again, and Paul put his arm around her and said they were done talking to me, that I'd made my choice and they'd remember it. They left. I called my dad that night and told him about the landlord conversation and Sophie and Paul showing up. Dad sighed and said this was getting out of hand, that I was actively making their lives harder when I could just be patient for payment. I said I'd been patient for 4 months. Dad said housing was serious and I shouldn't involve their landlord. I said their landlord deserved to know who he was renting to. Dad said I was being vindictive now, not just seeking repayment. That stung more than I expected. My own father was defending them. I asked if he'd feel the same way if someone threw his gift in the trash and borrowed money they never repaid. Dad said he understood I was hurt, but this had gone beyond the original issue. Mom got on the phone and said Sophie had called her sobbing about potentially losing their house, that I needed to stop whatever I was doing. I said they weren't going to lose their house unless they kept not paying rent, which wasn't my fault. Mom said I was being cruel. We argued for a while. It ended with both parents disappointed in me, which was a new experience. They thought I should drop it and write off the money as the cost of family peace. I said family peace shouldn't require me to subsidize their fake lifestyle and accept disrespect. January 7th, things escalated in a way I didn't anticipate. Paul's parents called a family meeting at their house for that evening. Not a request, a demand. They told my parents, they told Sophie and Paul, they told me. Everyone was expected to be there at 7 p.m. I showed up at 6:55. My parents were already there looking stressed. Sophie and Paul arrived exactly at 7. Hugo and Noelle sat everyone down in their formal living room, and Hugo said this situation had spiraled completely out of control, and it was ending tonight one way or another. Hugo said Paul and Sophie owed them $9,800 total, including the wedding loan and various other loans over the years. They'd been asking for repayment for years and getting excuses. Paul started to say something and Hugo cut him off. Hugo said he'd learned from my parents that Sophie also owed them $600. He'd learned from me that Sophie owed me $2,400. The total family debt was over $12,800, and none of it was being repaid while Sophie and Paul maintained an expensive lifestyle. Paul said their lifestyle wasn't anyone's business. Hugo said it became his business when they asked to borrow money. Noelle said they'd been enabling this behavior for 3 years and it needed to stop. She looked at my parents and said Sophie and Paul had a pattern of borrowing money and never paying it back while spending money on appearances, and all of us had allowed it by not communicating with each other. Sophie said they'd had legitimate emergencies. Hugo asked which emergencies required $9,800. Sophie said the wedding, the car, medical expenses, unexpected bills. Hugo said the wedding was their choice to have an expensive event they couldn't afford. The car was poor planning. He asked what medical expenses. Sophie hesitated and said dental work. Hugo said when. Sophie said last year. Hugo said they'd never mentioned dental work and there'd been no request for medical expense loans. It was becoming clear Sophie had been lying about why they needed money. Paul sat there looking angry but quiet. My dad asked Paul directly what their actual financial situation was. Paul said they were fine, just managing cash flow like most people. My dad said most people don't owe $12,800 to family members. The meeting went on for 2 hours. It was brutal. Every excuse got dismantled. Every justification got challenged. Sophie cried. Paul got defensive and angry. Hugo finally gave them an ultimatum. They had until February 1st to provide a written repayment plan with actual dates and amounts for paying back everyone they owed. If they didn't, Hugo and Noelle would no longer help them with anything, including being references for housing or co-signing anything. Sophie asked what they were supposed to do if they lost their house. Noelle said they'd need to find somewhere they could actually afford. Paul said this was about control, that his parents were punishing them for not living the way Hugo and Noelle wanted them to live. Hugo said this was about responsibility and integrity, 2 things Paul clearly didn't understand. We left that meeting with nothing resolved except everyone being angry and exhausted. My parents barely spoke to me on the way out. Sophie and Paul left separately and quickly. But here's what happened after that made everything even more complicated. Sophie started calling different family members and friends trying to build support for their side. She called my Aunt Ashley and complained about me sabotaging them. She called cousins I barely saw. She posted a vague Instagram story about family betrayal and fake people showing their true colors. She was launching a counteroffensive, trying to make me the villain and them the victims. And some people were buying it. I started getting texts from extended family asking what was going on, why I was being so hard on Sophie. Couldn't I just forgive the debt and move on? Sophie had positioned herself as the struggling younger sister being bullied by her successful older brother who couldn't let go of a small amount of money. The narrative was shifting, and I realized my next move needed to be decisive because if I let Sophie control the story, I'd end up looking like the bad guy while they kept living their fake life on everyone else's money. The Mexico trip was in 5 weeks. Their lease renewal decision was coming up, and I still hadn't been paid a single dollar. Time to stop playing nice and start making sure everyone saw exactly what Sophie and Paul had been doing, in a way they couldn't spin or escape. More to come because this is about to get even messier. Final update. This is probably going to be my last update because the situation has reached its conclusion. And honestly, I need to step back from all of this. To everyone who said I should have just let it go, you might have been right about the cost. To everyone who said they deserved consequences, well, they got them. The 3 weeks since my last update have been absolutely exhausting. Sophie's campaign to paint me as the villain actually gained some traction with extended family who didn't know the full story. My cousin reached out saying she heard I was harassing Sophie over a small loan and making threats about their housing. Another family friend posted something vague on social media about forgiveness and family bonds that was clearly directed at the situation. Sophie was good at playing the victim, I'll give her that. January 10th, I got a text from Sophie saying she'd raised $600 and could pay me that amount immediately if I'd agree to stop talking to their landlord and remove the social media pressure. I asked where the other $1,800 was. She said they'd pay $300 monthly starting in February. I said no, that wasn't the deal. She said it was the best they could do and I could either accept it or get nothing. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I did something I'd been planning since the family meeting at Hugo and Noelle's house. I created a detailed timeline document of every loan Sophie and Paul had taken from family members, every promise to repay, every excuse given, and every expensive purchase or activity they'd posted about during the same time frames. I included screenshots of their social media posts next to the dates of their loan requests. The Mexico resort booking announcement right next to texts about being unable to afford car repairs. The expensive restaurant photos right next to messages about being between paychecks. I didn't post it publicly. Instead, I sent it to Hugo and Noelle, to my parents, to Paul's brother Spencer, and to 3 of Sophie's close friends who'd been defending her online. I included a note saying I wasn't asking anyone to take sides. I just wanted to make sure everyone had access to the same information before making judgments about the situation. The response was immediate and divided. Hugo called me and said the timeline was damning, but also said I was being aggressive in a way that made him uncomfortable. Noelle said they needed to see it because it confirmed what they'd suspected. My mom called crying, saying I was tearing the family apart. My dad said the document was factual, but distributing it felt vindictive. Spencer said it matched everything he'd already figured out and thanked me for organizing it clearly. 2 of Sophie's friends didn't respond. The third one, someone named Ashley, who'd known Sophie since college, texted me saying she'd loaned Sophie $400 last year that was never repaid, and she'd felt guilty for being upset about it. Now she understood it was part of a pattern. Sophie found out about the document on January 12th when one of her friends asked her about it directly. She called me at 10 p.m. screaming, actually screaming. She said I'd created a hit piece designed to destroy her life, that I was spreading private family business to people who had no right to know, that what I'd done was defamation, and she was talking to a lawyer about it. I stayed calm and asked which part of the document was untrue. She said it wasn't about truth, it was about intent, that I deliberately presented everything in the worst possible light to damage her reputation. I said I presented facts with timestamps. She said the facts were taken out of context. I asked what context made borrowing money and never repaying it while posting vacation photos acceptable. She said I was twisting everything and she wasn't going to engage with my manipulations. Paul got on the phone. He said they were done being nice, that I'd crossed every line, that they were going to make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. I said everyone already knew what kind of people they were because I'd shown them with their own words and actions. Paul said I'd regret this. I said I regretted loaning them money in the first place. He hung up. January 15th, the deadline I'd originally given them, came and went. No payment. Not even the $600 Sophie had offered. Nothing. At that point, I'd been owed the money for 4 full months. That same day, I got a call from their landlord, Hugo. He said he'd made a decision about their lease renewal. He was requiring either full payment of all back late fees plus a doubled security deposit, or he was declining to renew their lease. The late fees totaled $840 and the additional deposit would be $2,800. They'd need to come up with $3,640 by February 15th to stay in the house. I asked if my conversation with him had influenced that decision. He said partially, but mostly it was their payment history and the fact that he'd verified they had multiple outstanding debts through other sources now. He said he couldn't afford to have tenants who were financially unstable. It was a business decision. Sophie and Paul found out about the lease situation on January 16th. Sophie called my parents hysterical, saying they were going to be homeless and it was my fault. Paul apparently drove to Hugo and Noelle's house and demanded they co-sign a new lease or loan them the money for the deposit and fees. Hugo refused both. Paul said they were abandoning their son when he needed help. Hugo said they'd been helping for 3 years and it hadn't changed anything. My parents called me that night and begged me to back off. Mom said Sophie was having panic attacks about losing their house. Dad said whatever point I'd been trying to make had been made, and I needed to stop actively making their situation worse. I said I wasn't making it worse. Their own choices and inability to pay rent on time made it worse. Dad said I'd deliberately talked to their landlord knowing it would create problems. I said their landlord deserved to know the truth about his tenants. We argued for over an hour. It ended with my mom saying she was ashamed of me, that family was supposed to support each other, not destroy each other over money. Those words hit hard. My own mother was ashamed of me for expecting to be paid back money I'd loaned in good faith. January 18th, Sophie posted a long Instagram story about betrayal and family toxicity and how sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who hurt you most. She didn't name me, but it was obvious. She got a lot of supportive comments from people who didn't know the full story. She also lost another 50 followers, including people who'd seen the timeline document or heard about the situation from mutual connections. January 20th, Paul's company announced their quarterly commission numbers. According to Spencer, who heard it from Paul's parents, Paul's numbers were bad, really bad. His income for the first quarter would be about 40% lower than the previous year. They couldn't afford their current lifestyle even if they had zero debt, and they had over $12,000 in family debt plus whatever credit cards they were carrying. The Mexico vacation was supposed to be February 10th through 17th. On January 22nd, Sophie posted that they'd decided to postpone their vacation due to unexpected circumstances. The post was carefully worded to make it sound like a voluntary choice, but I knew they'd had to cancel because they couldn't afford it on top of their housing situation. January 24th, Sophie and Paul moved out of their rental house. Not because they were evicted, they chose to leave rather than come up with the $3,640 their landlord required. They moved into a smaller apartment across town that cost $1,800 a month instead of $2,800. I heard about this from Spencer, who helped them move some furniture. The new apartment was in a very different neighborhood. Not unsafe, but definitely not the image they'd been projecting. It was a standard apartment complex with parking lots and shared walls and no luxury amenities. According to Spencer, Sophie cried the entire time they were moving boxes. My parents helped them move. Dad called me afterward and said I should see what I'd done, that Sophie and Paul had lost their house and had to downsize their entire life. I said they'd lost their house because they couldn't afford it and spent money on appearances instead of rent. Dad said I'd been the catalyst that forced the landlord's decision. I said the catalyst was their own payment history. We haven't spoken since that conversation. It's been 4 days. January 26th, Sophie sent me a text at 2 a.m. It was long and rambling and clearly written while emotional. She said I'd won, that I'd successfully destroyed everything they'd built, that they'd had to cancel Mexico and move to a worse apartment, and Paul's parents weren't speaking to them, and her friends were asking uncomfortable questions. She said I'd humiliated them in front of everyone who mattered, and she hoped I was happy with myself. She said the photo album Paul threw away was tacky and juvenile, and she'd never wanted it in the first place, but she should have pretended to like it because that's what you do with gifts from family. She said I took one bad moment and used it to justify ruining their lives. She said I was cruel and vindictive and she'd never forgive me for what I'd done. Then she said they'd pay me back the full $2,400 in installments starting in March, $400 per month for 6 months, and after that, I needed to never contact them again. She said they were also paying Hugo and Noelle $200 monthly and my parents $100 monthly until all family debts were cleared. She said it would take them 2 years to pay everyone back, but they were committing to it because they weren't the terrible people I'd made them out to be. I read that text multiple times. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement that throwing my gift in the trash while owing me money was wrong, no recognition that they'd borrowed from multiple people and never paid anyone back, just anger that I'd exposed them, and consequences had followed. I texted back, I'll accept $400 monthly starting March 1st. First payment comes to me before anyone else since I was owed first. If you miss a single payment, I'll pursue other options. She responded, you've already destroyed everything. What else could you possibly do? I didn't answer that. January 28th, which is today, I got a payment notification. Sophie and Paul sent me $400. Not due until March, but they sent it anyway. I don't know if it's a peace offering or if they're just trying to prove they can do it. Either way, I have $400 of my $2,400 back. Hugo and Noelle told my parents they're maintaining their position. No more loans, no co-signing anything, no financial help until existing debts are cleared. Paul apparently tried one more time to convince them to reconsider, and Hugo told him they were done enabling his lifestyle. Paul hasn't spoken to them since. Sophie's Instagram has gone mostly quiet. She posted once about new beginnings and fresh starts, a photo of their new apartment living room that she'd clearly staged to look better than it is. It got maybe 100 likes compared to her usual 3 or 400. Her follower count is down to about 2,400 from the 3,000 she had at Christmas. My relationship with my parents is damaged, maybe permanently. Mom says she understands why I was upset, but can't understand why I had to take it so far. Dad says I prioritized money over family, and that's not how he raised me. They helped Sophie and Paul move, and they've been checking in on them regularly. They haven't checked in on me once. The extended family is split. Some people think I was justified. Some think I was cruel. Some don't want to be involved at all and have distanced themselves from everyone. So here's where I land on all of this. Was I right to expose them? Yes. They'd been taking advantage of multiple family members while maintaining a fake lifestyle and treating people with contempt. They needed to face consequences and they needed to stop being enabled. Did I take it too far? Probably. Talking to their landlord was aggressive. Creating and distributing the timeline document was calculated. I knew what would happen and I did it anyway because I wanted them to hurt the way they'd hurt me. Do I regret it? I regret that it cost me my relationship with my parents. I regret that family gatherings are going to be awkward or impossible for years. I regret that my nephew growing up will know me as the uncle who destroyed his parents' life over money. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret refusing to enable their behavior. And I don't regret making sure they couldn't keep doing this to other people. Sophie and Paul are paying me back $400 monthly. They're paying Hugo and Noelle $200 monthly. They're paying my parents $100 monthly. They're living in an apartment they can actually afford. They're not posting constant photos of expensive purchases. Their fake lifestyle collapsed, and they're living in reality now. That's the consequence they needed. Whether I was the right person to enforce it, whether I did it the right way, whether the cost to my family relationships was worth it, those are questions I'm going to be processing for a long time. To the commenters who said I should have just walked away and written off the money, you were right that it would have been easier. To the commenters who said they needed to learn a lesson, they're learning it, but so am I. Family is complicated. Money and family is more complicated. And sometimes standing up for yourself means accepting that people who should support you will instead blame you for not quietly accepting mistreatment. I'll update if anything major changes with the payments or family situation. But for now, I'm stepping back from all of it and focusing on my own life. The life Sophie called boring and mediocre. The one where I pay my bills on time and don't owe anyone money and don't throw people's gifts in the trash. Turns out boring and mediocre looks pretty good when the alternative is what Sophie and Paul are dealing with now. Thanks for reading and for all the support and criticism in the comments. It helped me think through what I was doing, even when I didn't take the advice to stop.